Let's talk about fingering the guard and how it eventually died out with the small sword, or did it? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now I have talked about fingering the guard. That means putting your index finger over the lead quillon or front of the guard. I've talked about that particularly in its early development, but here we're going to look at its late development and how it ended up. But before we go into the late period swords, let's briefly talk about the earlier period swords in case you haven't seen my other videos or you're just in need of some more deep context. Right, so in the 15th century, a number of swords started to develop fingerings. Now, this is a late 15th century style of sword. Let's go back in time to the early 15th century. Now, this is the sword that is based on an example from the Alexandria arsenal. This is the version, the replica by L.K. Chen. I got the measurements of the original, which now is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and we reproduced it as close as we could with L.K. Chen. Very nice sword it is too. Now, this, you will notice, has a very little, quite dainty little fingering on the front here. Now, if we ignore that for a second, in earlier periods, before they put fingerings on, people started to put their index finger over the front guard. This gives you increased control, it brings the point online for better thrusting. It's got numerous physical benefits. We're not going to talk about those here. I've dealt with those in previous videos. But to protect the finger when doing that, they started to develop this little spur or extension here to the guard in order to protect the finger. Now, L.K. Chen himself, when I sent him the measurements and drawings for this sword, he said this ring was too small to get his finger through, and I said, but that's because you're not holding it right. And that was simply because you're only supposed to put the tip of the finger through. At the time, finger rings were a new thing to L.K. He's since become far more au fait and familiar with them. So in this particular case, when you're holding the sword, you hold it essentially like a normal arming sword, but perhaps sometimes, perhaps not even all the time, you slip the tip of your index finger through that ring there in order to get better control of the point for cutting or thrusting. You can give small sniping cuts with the front or back edge, and of course you can have better point control. And for that reason, finger rings became very popular on swords which had increased focus on the use of the point. Swords like this, which we these days call side swords, developed into rapiers, of which I've got some behind. We'll get onto the rapiers in a second. But finger rings very soon started to develop one on each side because it's a double-edged symmetrical sword. You wanted to be able to use it either way around. And so they put finger rings on both sides, and these were particularly popular in the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. So, finger rings became very popular. They spread throughout Europe. In fact, they became completely normal, such that by the age of the rapier, we end up with pretty much all rapiers. I'll just pull off one at random here, have a finger ring inside the cup there. So they are integral to the way that you actually grip and use the sword. Okay, now when you get cups like this, you actually find sometimes the finger rings inside disappear because when you've got the cup on there, you no longer need the ring to protect the finger because you've got a cup in front of the hand, but you still put the index finger over that front guard. And in fact, if we grab this example up here of a Spanish rapier, but sometimes they do in fact maintain the finger rings, and you can just about hopefully see in there we have finger rings in here. Now those finger rings which sometimes are present and sometimes not present with cup hilt rapiers, they're pretty much always present with swept hilt rapiers, which consist of a series of bars, but with a cup hilt they're not always present. But they can tell us a number of things, but they can also, as well as being somewhere to put your finger through, they can also help support the cup. So these cups can actually be somewhat difficult to attach to the rest of the hilt, and very often you will find that the bars of the finger ring actually attach to the inside of the cup. We're actually going to look at some examples of those soon in another video, looking specifically at Spanish rapiers and Bilbo style broadswords, which I dealt with in a recent video, but we're going to look at those again because I have another example to show. But finger rings in here, you can put the finger through, and in fact they tell you sometimes about the use of the rapier, because if you've got particularly big finger ring and a short grip, that will often tell you that the intended way of holding the rapier is to put two fingers through the ring and therefore only have two fingers gripping the grip here, so therefore you need a shorter grip, or you don't need such a long grip rather. So finger rings, usually one index finger, sometimes two, particularly in Spain and southern Italy, if I put that one back for a second. Now, many of you will know that the rapier ultimately evolved into the small sword. And if I grab one example here, now this actually has a cut and thrust blade, so it's not a completely typical small sword because it has the capacity to cut. It actually has an edged, double-edged blade. But you'll notice it has fairly prominent and noticeable finger rings. Now, again, it's important to point out that the intention with these finger rings on small swords was not to insert your entire finger through, although you can physically do it in this case because they're quite big finger rings. If you do that, you're now holding the small sword in an incredibly ham-fisted way. In fact, if you put the finger through at all, it should really only be just the tip, okay? Just the tip, remember that. So tip of the finger goes through there, and when you hold it like that, then with a sort of handshake grip with the finger just poking through at the end there, that brings the whole sword into line and everything works well. You've got great control over the tip of the weapon, which is what's being thrust at the other person. Great control in parrying, either with the front edge or the back edge, in sict, cut, terce, however you're parrying, second, prime of the various parries, gives you great control in parrying, great control in attacking, and a great purchase and command on the weapon. So that point of control is really, really nice and obviously was very popular right the way through the 17th and into the 18th century. But what we do find is there do start to be certain fencing masters who advise against putting the actual tip, even just the tip of your finger through the finger ring. They actually advise to put it against the side. So in that case, the finger comes up against the side of the finger ring like that, and it still gives you a point of control, it still gives you leverage without sticking your finger through. Now this is a personal preference, but one potential advantage of not putting your finger through is if someone jars your sword, like hits it very hard with a beat, or cut perhaps if they're using a backsword or something like that, or indeed if they disarm you, you don't now have your finger stuck through the ring and potentially broken. Instead it's sitting against the side and is a little bit more free to get out of there should you need to do so. Obviously you don't want to be disarmed, so that's not really an ideal situation. But these finger rings vary in size. If I just grab another example up here, so this is an English, that was a German small sword, this is an English small sword with a silver hilt, and you'll notice it's still got fairly prominent rings. And so you can really hold this in two ways. You can either put the tip of the finger through the ring and get the control like that, or you can put it alongside the ring. Now I should also mention there are other ways of holding small swords, and some people recommend actually not putting your finger up there at all. Some people put the thumb against the flat. Some people put the finger up and the thumb against the flat, a bit like you're pinching. That's this section up here, like this sort of neck. So there's various ways of holding it. There's no right or wrong, there's just essentially personal preference. But finger rings remain a thing even when they're no longer being used to put the finger through. Now, this is what I really want to talk about. The rings got smaller and smaller, and there is a tendency as we go through the 18th century for these rings to diminish in importance because fewer and fewer people were actually using them as finger rings. And this is the culmination. This is a late 18th century, it's actually Georgian, it might even be early 19th century. Small sword, very nice thing. It has GR markings, so it's for a military officer in the British Army who would have been serving in the Napoleonic period, and for some reason they wanted either as a court sword or as a dueling sword, we don't know. Silver hilt, very nice small sword with a triangular section blade, not a colishmard, but you will notice, look at those little finger rings. So I'm going to bring that up nice and close. They are no longer finger rings, okay? These are now just remnants of finger rings. They're still there, there's still a reference to them because culturally they thought, well, you know, the small sword's supposed to have something there, so we'll still put them in there, but they are in no way, shape or form functional finger rings anymore. So we can categorically say that this sword would have been held much like a foil, and at most the finger would have rested up here against the side of that little junction there, and it's still a good place to stick your index finger, with your thumb usually up here opposite the end of your index finger, And you've got a lovely hold on this, just like you'd have with a foil, with a fencing foil, or of the time, which usually has a longer grip, but nevertheless. But they are no longer functional fingerings. So you could say to me, so Matt, does that mean that fingerings, which have been around since the 15th century, they were hugely popular in the 16th century, massively popular in the 17th century, except with certain types of cup hilts and walloons and things like that? We'll talk about thumb rings another time. That's a whole other interesting topic. I've got a good example to show those. Does that mean that they gradually disappeared in the 18th century? Well, yes and no. In fact, we do still find examples of small sword with finger rings right the way through to the end of the 18th century. So some people still had small swords with finger rings on them up to the end of the 18th century, firstly. But secondly, they didn't completely disappear. There were some people who kept finger rings. So particularly in Spain and parts of Italy, if we look at the Italian foil still has finger rings. The Spanish continued using cup hilts, and they often have finger rings. Not always, but they often have finger rings inside the cup, which also helps support the cup. We'll maybe look at that in more detail another time. So that certain people still used finger rings functionally. They still stuck their finger through them. Other people just kept them for almost because they thought that's what the sword should look like, say for a small sword, even if you weren't putting your finger through. But here's a thing that often gets forgotten when we're talking about finger rings. I'm running out of space to put swords down here. This, I would say, is one of the last remnants. If we ignore the Italian foil, which is still being produced today and continued right the way through the 20th century, if we ignore the Italian foil used in classical fencing, this is the military use of the finger ring, which still remained right the way through to the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And that, surprisingly, is on sabers. And that's right, it is this in here. So can you see just in there? Now, you only find these on, or mostly only find them on sabers from parts of Germany, Austria and Switzerland sometimes. Very occasionally in Italy, very occasionally in other places, but generally speaking, the homeland of this finger ring here, or loop, is really the Germanic lands in the middle of Europe. Okay, so Germany, Austria, Switzerland. And this actually fulfills the same function. So if we draw, this is a German, Solingen made. I'm actually not sure which state of Germany it's from. In auction, this was listed as Bavarian, but there's no evidence to suggest that, although it does have a coat of family coat of arms on the bottom, but maybe we'll look at that another time. What's interesting is this particular saber actually has a grip shaped like the Schlager used in the Mensier. Okay, so this shape of grip is associated with the Schlager, and so it's got a dip for the thumb, a very German style grip. But in addition to that, it's got this finger loop here, and functionally this has almost exactly the same use as on a side sword or a rapier or a small sword, and that is to give increased leverage. Okay, in this case it's predominantly for the cut, but it does also give you more control with the tip for thrusting and for parrying as well. So really, I would say that this is the last survival, this loop, this little finger loop here, that we find in certain particularly German and Austrian sabers. This finger loop is the last survival of the finger ring that started in the 15th century on originally swords like this. So a long old history of the finger ring, and yet something which gets widely overlooked in things written about swords, gets widely overlooked, I think, in people's understanding of how swords are used. So there we go, the finger ring, its history right the way through a bunch of different swords. If you've got any specific questions, get posting down below, or other examples you'd like me to show. I will be looking again at Spanish swords, like the bilbo here, and the rapier, very, very soon, and I probably will also look at thumb rings quite soon as well. Anyway, I have been Matt Easton, I'll continue to be. I hope I see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.